No country in the world, in the history of the world, has endured the hemorrhage which this island endured over a period of a few years of so many of her sons and daughters. These sons and daughters are scattered throughout the world, and they give this small island a family of millions upon millions who are scattered all over the globe, who have been among the best and most loyal citizens of the countries that they have gone to, but have also kept a special place in their memory, in many cases their ancestral memory, of this green and misty island.
that two judges, a judge in Spain, Balthazar Garzon, and a French judge, Judge Sophie Hélène Chateau, have both filed commission rogatoire for the detention of Henry Kissinger, former US Secretary of State, for questioning under the European Convention on Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters. This man, Henry Kissinger, is now present in Ireland in the Four Seasons Hotel, today in Dublin, on the 8th of May 2010. So I'm now telling the Garda Sergeant in charge of here that this man is present and ought to be detained and held for questioning by these judges.
Garda E27.
Can you do so immediately, Garda?
Did you discharge your duty?
Unless this man disappears before... Well, that's up to the authorities here. We're informing the authorities now that this man is present, that their obligation is, under the European Convention, to have him detained and brought to Paris or Madrid for questioning.
Appreciate you wanting to do that.
Yeah, but the authorities here can do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I know that, but we're saying that we're now informing the authorities in public here in front of witnesses.
RTE is the national broadcaster. RTE tells us the news, and it therefore informs public debate and tells us what to think and discuss about. Why didn't RTE cover the most incredible meeting that took place in this city 10 days ago, which I found myself unwittingly in the middle of, where we had the meeting of the Trilateral Commission. One public meeting of the plenary session was chaired by Peter Sutherland, who's on the Bilderberg Committee, the Trilateral Commission.
We can't cover every meeting.
Excuse me, David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger were there.
You can write to the Broadcasting Complaints Commission or the DG.
And you are ignoring it.
And it's about 7 billion of funds. This is 7 billion bridging. Yeah. So it's bridged off. We can pay you back, which is never. Yeah. And that's in the promo. That's in the terms and conditions. That's right. We'll pay. It's going to give you a personal hand. So under the terms that say repayment, we said no. Yeah. No, not applicable. Okay. And what's he say? So anyway, change underwear. It was a bit of that. Jeez, that's a lot of dosh. Jesus fucking hell. And God, well, you know, the central bank only has 14 billion of total investment, so that'll be going up to 20. Geez, that'll be seen. And how do we do that? Geez, we need to give you. Geez, you're kind of asking us to play ducks and drakes with the regulations, and we said, yeah. We said, look, what we're telling you is that if we get into difficulties, we have 100,000 plus lump sum depositors in Ireland, all of whom will be very welcome.
And how did you arrive at the 7?
Just, the stronger would say, picked it out of my arse, you know. Look, what we did was we basically said, what is the amount that we can securitize over the next 6 months?
Yeah.
And basically say to them, look, our problem is time. It's not our ability to create the liquidity. The enemy is time here.
Yeah.
But the strategy here is you pull them in, you get them to write a big check, and they have to support their money, you know.
Yeah. They've got skin in the game. That's the key.
They have, and they've invested a lot. If they saw the enormity of it up front, they might decide they have a choice. You know what I mean? They might say that the cost of taxpayers is too high.
The Anglo bankers may be home and dry. They may actually be home and dry. There'll be no chance of prosecution. The statute of limitations will run out. The statute of limitations will run out before the end of the year on this information.
We're asking you a question.
Why was the Garda investigation stopped? Why was it abandoned? There's no Garda investigation. The DPP will not move on this. The DPP will not make any move to prosecute on this. Previous government and this government have sat on this information and done nothing. They've absolutely betrayed the people.
When a bank extends a loan, it creates money. Let's say that I want to buy a very expensive watch of 100,000 euros and I don't have the money. I can go to a bank and ask for a consumption loan. Now, If they're a good bank, they say no, that we're not going to give you the consumption loan to buy this expensive watch. But if they do give me it, they don't give me a bag of money. They will just take my credit card, my passport, perhaps there will be something done on a computer keyboard, some signatures, that's it, right? I walk away with the watch on my wrist, very happily, supposedly. Now, at this point, money has been created. This money didn't exist this morning when I got up and decided to buy the watch and take out a loan. That's new money, fresh money. That's how banks create money. Banks bring new money into the economy as they make up loans. Therefore, if you expand the stock of money, you also expand the stock of debt.
Basically, the banks sit there, they wait for deposits to arrive, and if they have enough deposits, they lend them out to somebody else. And that is completely wrong. This is the wrong model of banks, because what happens in reality is exactly the opposite. And I've done this, I'm a banker, I know that that's how it works, and you can read it on many central bank websites, that's how it works. Is that banks, when they decide the economy is good, we are optimistic, we are now making loans, they don't need to wait for any deposits, because when they make a loan, they create the deposit. Right there, banks create money out of thin air.
What are your views on the present-day banking system?
Well, it's strangling the life out of every economy on the surface of the planet, so I don't think very much of it. And I think what the major problem is that right now the banks have through lending to governments, they've essentially been able to co-opt the power of government. So we no longer have sovereign governments. We have what political science would call plutocracy, which is ruled by the rich. And it has nothing to do with capitalism. It's, if you want to call it anything, you'd call it monopoly capitalism. But it's almost actually gangsterism at this point. As you'll see from my presentation, Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University just is extremely hard on Wall Street, and basically he thinks the American version of the financial community, essentially Wall Street, through their competitive greed and complete lack of moral structure, are really behind the downfall of the economies of every nation on earth.
The government, when you talk about being legal, has sat around while our banks have been raided by private individuals for their personal profit, where 43 billion profit has been made in the last 3 years of the Celtic Tiger by 1% of the population. Profit that they've paid no tax on, bankers that have switched their accounts from account to account, and individuals who have directly and openly manipulated share value. In any other country that would be illegal. But for members of the Garda Síochána, the only thing that's legal in this country is picking their pockets.
There's many opinions, a plethora of opinions amongst the profession of economists as to the origin of the crisis. The most typical opinion would be that economic crises are to some extent unexplainable, that they are rooted in human nature, that economic crises, boom and bust cycles, banking crises have been really with man since the dawn of time, and that there's not much we can do about them. We just, the best we can do is use governments to alleviate the poverty that arises when banking crises strike. However, I would be of the opinion that banking crises are the direct and unavoidable consequence of the laws and regulations under which banks do business. So we must understand that in our society today, it is quite clear that we live in some people call it a debt-based society. It seems that the levels of debt, the number of people who have taken out mortgages, lifetime mortgages, 20 years, 40 years, has increased enormously. And it's clear that in the past, there was far less debt in circulation. However, the reason for this change lies in the fact that banks operate differently today than how they did in the past. So, for example, traditionally, for every €100 a bank lent to a customer, that was in fact backed by €100 worth of savings that someone had originally deposited in the bank as savings, and they'd allowed or agreed with the bank that their savings could be lent out as a loan. However, today banks are given the legal privilege to create loans from which they can profit without the need of first acquiring anyone's savings. It's essentially an accountancy trick where they are allowed to add credit to their balance sheets without first credit being on the liability side, without first having an asset to back that liability.
Ireland has an excellent written constitution from 1937, and the reason why we have that written constitution is because Irish men and Irish women fought and died so that Ireland could be a sovereign, self-governing nation. However, since 1937, our political elite have done their best to ignore the contents of that constitution, ignore the rights and the obligations placed upon them, and decided to interpret things as they so choose. We've had a number of occasions when the Irish people have voted against, for example, a European treaty, and that vote has been completely ignored. The Constitution also contains certain obligations on the state, for example, to support the woman in the home. The state has done the exact opposite. It has discriminated against mothers who look after their own children, instead forcing them to go out and rely on creches, commercial companies, to look after their children. And that, of course, has led to the recent scandal of children being abused by these companies. Well, it's hardly surprising if you're only going to pay minimum wage for somebody to work in a creche. You know, they're going to have a minimum wage attitude, but yet the state still continues to ignore its obligations, for example, to defend Irish culture. The Constitution also gives a very special role to the media. It's seen as having a particular role in highlighting certain issues and defending the interests of the nation as a whole. And yet, if you look at how the Irish media works, they are as much the cronies of the political elite as the building developers and the bankers are. We have a situation where a crony elite has more or less hijacked this entire country, the rights of this country, ignored the Constitution, imposed a huge burden of debt upon us and future generations to help bail out a few incompetent, possibly corrupt bankers and property developers. How in God's name did we ever end up in this situation?
I just explicitly say in the EU Charter that they retain the right not only to grant us these rights, but to take them back if they so choose. I have read the Charter.
And so have I. Europe can only do what we give it authority. And we retain competences ourselves.
We're surrendering our sovereignty, we're surrendering our constitution, we're surrendering our economy, we're surrendering our public health.
We're not surrendering our constitution. We're not surrendering our sovereignty. They need to make their choice the next day. Stay where we've been, right at the center of influence and confidence and power.
But you said that you released, you forced fed us to do this treaty. You forced fed us and said Europe absolutely needed to Nice Treaty.
You said we'd hand away our constitution.
And that without the Nice Treaty, Europe wouldn't be able to function.
And euthanasia and all of these things.
18 months after we approved the Nice Treaty, after we forced it a second time, they said Nice won't do, we have to have a European constitution.
On the last 5 referenda, you all said the same thing. European armies, conscription, handing away our neutrality, handing away our sovereignty.
Where are Irish soldiers right now?
This is all, they're in Chad.
They're in Chad. We have 180 soldiers in Chad, and we're propping up an African dictator. Idris Deby came to power as an African dictator.
He's keeping
the force. You use your force.
Even helping the poor people in
They're not helping the poor people, they're helping an African dictator who's been opposed. He's been opposed by his own people who tried to overthrow him several times.
That's what you stand for, go down there and tell the people that.
We're standing shoulder to shoulder with French troops keeping an African dictator in power.
There's nothing wrong with that. Hold on. Let's be quite clear here now. We should legalize a bank and give some money so that we can have a world forum where people can discuss real issues. We're just like crazy. Don't feel down. When you say we need go to asylum, go to an asylum.
Have you ever said yes and regretted it later? Well, you're not alone. When faced with a big decision, darling, how about we take the boat today? You can be left with a sinking feeling. What can seem like a positive choice at the time,
Mr. Surgeon, can you make me look like Liz Taylor?
Can cut off your nose to spite your face. A yes can be short-sighted. Sure, there won't be that many cars. Let's cut down on the lanes and slap some toll booths on it. And stupid. The things we value the most can be lost forever with a yes.
Granny Smith's Take the last year, Granny Smiths. Want an apple, love? Okay.
A yes without considering the consequences can topple a nation from the inside.
Yeah, but is it alright if I bring me horse in?
And even if it was a long time ago.
Sure, a few bob wouldn't hurt, would it?
What can seem like a harmless yes.
The nation is shocked this morning as Taoiseach Bertie Ahern has announced his resignation amidst the pressures.
Can break the unbreakable.
Bye.
It's an amazing thing, and we've stopped being amazed by it simply because of familiarity, but we should be shocked by it, that the only body that can propose new legislation in the European Union is the unelected European Commission. You know, if any country were run like that, if supreme power were wielded by 27 people who were immune to the ballot box, that would be regarded as an outrage. And yet the people who talk most fervently about turning the EU into something like a superstate are remarkably relaxed about the undemocratic nature of it. And from that basic lack of democracy, you get the contempt for popular opinion, you get the way it swats aside referendum results if they go the wrong way, you get the sense that public opinion is an obstacle to overcome rather than a reason to change direction. It is an extraordinary and sad paradox that 27 countries, each of them a liberal parliamentary democracy in its own right, have come together and accepted a system that would make Zimbabwe look democratic. I think the origins actually go back to the very beginning of the European Union. The founding fathers had had a very mixed experience of democracy, especially of the referendum, plebiscitary kind of democracy that had existed in the 1930s. And so they were quite open about deliberately vesting supreme power in the hands of wise, technocratic experts who wouldn't have to worry about public opinion, who'd be able to take the tough decisions. And of course, you know, there is no such person as the wise, disinterested expert. They all have their prejudices, they all have their assumptions, and freed from the constraints of public opinion, they were able to get on with creating an almost autocratic system, which has stayed in large measure in place to this day, which is why, you know, when people vote against it, that is seen as the beginning of the argument rather than as it would be in a proper democracy, the end of the argument. Yeah, it's wonderful, isn't it? We were told for 20 years that now was not the right time for a referendum because Europe wasn't an issue. And now we're told, no, it's the wrong time because Europe is an issue. You know, the Eurozone crisis and all this. I mean, it's the ultimate yes minister argument. You know, perfectly good idea in principle, minister, but perhaps now is not the most propitious occasion. If not now, when? You know, the Eurozone crisis has wrecked the premise on which we joined. It's falsified our membership terms.
Our constitution, as I say, sets out precisely what must happen for legislation to come into being. And remember that the Oireachtas, the only function of members of the Oireachtas is to write legislation. They're constantly involving themselves with other things, I'm sure, so that to avoid taking responsibility for what they should be doing. But the legislation they write must comply with the Constitution. If it doesn't, it must be put to the people and it must be presented properly. In Article 26 of our Constitution, it says a very, very important thing. It says that legislation being put to the people, this article applies to any bill. A bill is what is put before the houses of the Oireachtas to be passed by the Oireachtas or the Seanad, passed by one of them first according to the statute, what it says in our Constitution, and then it can be passed by the other house, say the Seanad. But in this bill, they changed it and said nothing. And if you see the contradiction, in Article 26 it says, this article applies to any bill passed or deemed to have been passed by both houses of the Oireachtas. Deemed to have been passed means it wasn't discussed. It cannot not be discussed because the Oireachtas or the Seanad have to vet it first. What's happening now since we joined the EU, or dare I say we joined the EEC, we were foisted into the EU, is that they're taking legislation which was not originated in Ireland and they're pushing it onto the Irish people by deeming it true. It's utterly illegal for us to have representatives whose only function is to write legislation, to deem legislation true without discussing it, onto the Irish people as though they're representing us and doing their job. So basically, in that form, they're taking money for writing legislation, they take substantial income, they have massive pensions, and then they take words from another source, doesn't matter if it's the EU or if it's from the Soviet Republic or of China or whatever they want to, wherever they want to take it from, and they put it on to us as though it's legal. Our Constitution says it isn't. Our Constitution says that it must be discussed in open Parliament, in open discussion. It must be presented as a bill, and the bill must then be given to the other house. If the other house, for example, the Seanad might have put it through, which rarely happens actually, and the Oireachtas might deem it true, or the Seanad would discuss it, or the Oireachtas would discuss it, and the Seanad would put it through. If the people don't know what's in the bill, the people cannot be expected to understand it. You can't foist legislation or things that direct our nation onto people if they're not told what it is. So the importance, again, of the Constitution is so critical. And the legislation that's being put through, in many respects, is mundane stuff that people wouldn't possibly notice. But there's so much subversive stuff in there. It's a dreadful, dreadful horror on our people and a shame on our politicians. But how they manage to do it is by inserting these words that legislation can be deemed to have been passed, where secrets are kept and false legislation is promoted and our people are suffering.
I'm standing here in the middle of Dublin's financial district. I'm surrounded by all the banks and financial institutions which are completely and totally responsible for the financial crash in Ireland, along with their relationship with the government, which was pathological, deliberately forcing the Irish people into debt in order to make them slaves of debt. So in the middle of all these notorious banks, financial institutions, we have the savage irony of a memorial to the Irish famine of 1847, which killed over 1.5 million people, slap bang in the middle of the pathological financial system which brought about the starvation and emigration of millions of Irish people in the last century. Because we in Ireland today don't experience these conditions anymore, we assume that they don't happen to anyone anymore. The reality is that the same financial institutions and banking families that caused this misery in the past are still doing it in the third world, or else they're exporting weapon systems to Africa and the Middle East and Asia. It's just business. It's always just business with the psychopathic control grid. Human beings are just human resources to be exploited, used and discarded in order to keep the business running. Nothing has changed since 1847. It's just that we in the West, we in the first world, we just don't experience it except through television. But it doesn't mean it doesn't happen anymore. It does. However, there's another manner which is never discussed but is far more insidious, and that is how the banking system is essentially responsible for what is called the poverty trap. Because when banks create new money, it does not enter, as some economists suggest, the entire economy equally, that it raises everyone's income statements equally at the same time and everyone becomes richer all at the same time. Some economists suggest central banks are like they're like in helicopters going around the country throwing out money out of the side of their helicopter, and that everyone wins through whenever the central banks print money. However, the reality is that money is injected into the money markets in specific channels, and this money enters the bank balances of banks first, and also governments and those who are politically and economically connected to the banking system, to the central banking system as well. And what we see is that as these politicians and bankers acquire these funds through the credit creation process, they then enter the marketplace and purchase goods that have not been affected by this increase in the money supply as of yet. The money has been so far just resting in their accounts, So the prices in market goods, in the marketplace, have not changed until they arrive with this new money that they've created, and they purchase goods that otherwise would have been purchased by other market participants who've been earning their money in trades or professions or whatever. And they essentially bid these goods away from these other market participants, and in the process raise the price of these goods which they're purchasing. Now, this money then enters the balance sheets of whoever, the shopkeepers or the business people that these bankers and politicians are dealing with. And these shopkeepers and business people then enter the marketplace themselves with this new money that they otherwise would not have received had the money supply not been increased by the central bank. So they go with a bigger balance sheet than they otherwise would have had, and they purchase other goods in the economy, raising their prices and taking these goods away from other people that otherwise would have been able to purchase them. But the real insidious nature of this process, which is called Cantillon effect, is that the people who are at the very last to receive this money are always going to be those who are on fixed incomes, who are on minimum wage jobs, who are on pensions. These are the people who will essentially, they will be continuing working, and they will be seeing all the prices of all the consumer goods which they purchase being bid up and being raised in their midst. However, their incomes themselves will not be increasing in a comparable manner. And essentially what has happened is that the purchasing power of the poor and the pensioners and all of these people who are on the margins of society has been transferred into the politicians' bank accounts and into the bankers' bank accounts. So you have the most terrible responsibility of this system of poverty where the poor seem to be unable to save and to take themselves, lift themselves out of the poverty in which they've been born in, is really a result of the banking system itself.
Good evening, my name is Yair Olmert. I'm a lawyer. I'm the nephew of the former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert, and I was the head of a large law firm which served the bank system in Israel until 2002.
You know for a fact that the major political parties in Israel take major loans from banks.
Yeah, of course. Most of the major parties in Israel, the most important and significant ones, take loans and are financed by the banks in a certain way, in a special way that helps the banks hold them short, I say, and get control of them. It's called on-call loans.
So what we're talking about here are short-term notes that can be called in either 60 or 90 days. They aren't called as long as the parties are good. But if the parties are bad, there's always that threat. They can call in their loans immediately, and these loans are so large that it would completely bankrupt the party.
Of course, the parties owe the bank something like 3 or 5 times their assets.
Yeah.
Most of the time, and this is the measure that the banks take to ensure that the politicians do what they want. It's not only theoretical. There are several times that they really did it, and several times I was there, and I know personally that they used this threat to achieve their goals, to manipulate the political system.
This is crazy, but it is probably what goes on in every nation on earth today. It is probably what goes on in Ireland. It is probably what goes on in Iceland, Greece, Crete, Portugal, Spain, and probably the U.S. Is there anyone out there who now cannot see how destructive this control of the legislative process is to the concept of freedom, to the concept of government, of the people, by the people, and for the people, to the notion of equal justice under the law? You just cannot have banks in control of the political process. This isn't hard. Anyone can figure this out.
simple game. You have the numbers 1 to 36. You spin the wheel, the ball drops, you get your stake back, and you get a bit extra, hopefully, if you won. People assume it's purely based on chance. They have a good chance of winning, they have a good chance of losing. What they forget, however, is there is one extra number in this game. It's the 0, and that's the house advantage. Overall, in the long term, you're inevitably going to lose your money. That's how roulette works. That's how casinos work. You're inevitably going to lose your money bit by bit. Although the house advantage is only 2.7%, people would think, well, that's quite reasonable. I can still play to those odds, and I could probably still come out with something extra. The fact is, in the long term, you will lose your money. This is how the modern economy works. This is how modern Ireland works. Taxes, small taxes, a little tax here, a little tax there. Introduce a bin charge, introduce a property tax, and eventually even introduce water charges. All small taxes, all slowly eaten away at your income, at the wages that you are earning. And more wealth is going back to the state, and less wealth for the vast majority of people. Not only is it the people who are on minimum wage beginning to feel the pinch, but even those who would have fairly comfortable middle class incomes. Slowly but surely, every day, every week, every month, every year, a little bit extra is going back to the government. So in the long term, it is the state, it is the rich, it is the elite who are getting more and more of that wealth, while everybody else loses. And that is the modern Irish economy for you.
The term psychopath has been in use for about 100 years. It wasn't scientifically quantified, though, until the 1940s, when an American psychiatrist called Herbie Cleckley wrote a book called The Mask of Sanity. He described a psychopath as an individual with an internal state of chaos, a perfect mimic of an otherwise normally functioning human being, and then this individual would demonstrate purposeful, self-destructive and destructive behaviour, and then project it upon others. We were to strip that down to layman's terms, which is basically the language I've used in my first book, Puzzling People. It's essentially somebody who is a chameleon, invents a personality to work a person, place, or entity, such as an organisation, uniquely for their own personal gain, and will do anything to achieve that objective, and will undertake this without a care in the world. There will be no remorse, there will be no compassion, there will be no sense of guilt. A psychopath goes through their life just business. A business to them is anything from destroying a country to getting married to having children. The only objective is the desires and the aims that the psychopath needs. It sees everybody as a target or a potential target to be used and manipulated. Regarding the psychopathology of the present banking, financial, governmental, and as you said, religious systems, well, it's been going for a long time. It's just that today with technology, we have an absolute power structure, which I call the psychopathic control grid. Now, I'm not saying the leaders of all these institutions are psychopaths. Some of them most certainly are. But the institution itself is psychopathic. It behaves like a psychopath. It has no compassion for anybody or anything. The profit in banking, the profit always comes first. There is no other agenda. There's no responsibility, not even to apart from maybe even the shareholders, but there's no responsibility to or accountability for their actions in terms of achieving these profits. They will destroy nations, they will destroy individuals, they will destroy themselves. It's a pathological drive that is suicidal, and it's not only destroying nations and peoples and families, it's destroying the planet. The planet is actually being destroyed by these psychopathic control systems that have risen to the top now, particularly in the financial business. Now, there's a lot of people who work in the financial business, being an ex-Wall Street employee myself, who are not psychopathic, they're just doing their job. But there's a lot of this kind of thing, almost like a sense of denial, a cognitive dissonance. They really truly believe that they're probably doing good in many cases. I actually feel that a lot of these sort of bizarre, intergovernmental think tanks are actually filled with a lot of well-meaning, very wealthy idiots. But they're still operating under a psychopathic system. The idea is that the ultimate objective is all that matters. And what happens along the way, and who's destroyed along the way, and what damage is done along the way is simply not part of the equation. You see that in governments. Governments today, in just about every Western country, is divided into two parties now. One pretend left party, one pretend right party. But this has been set up deliberately so that it does not affect the commercial and banking and military industrial complex that is behind these systems. That always goes on. And what they do with democracy is they give us an interactive play that we get to clap every 4 years of who's the best actor, where a vote literally means nothing. So that's how the political system has become psychopathic.
Take the United States, for example. Figure it out. We have a gang of 535. That's right. 535 senators and congressmen telling 312 million people how to tie their shoes. I mean, come on. They're not representing us. They only represent the rich and the powerful. End of story, period. This is not representative form of government. It's the same thing in every country. They don't give you a choice. They only make believe you have a choice. They do not represent you. Only imbeciles believe that politicians care about you. They say that during election time, and there are enough stupid people that believe it. And they say, well, I think my candidate really cares about me. Yeah, they care about you. You only can care about yourself. And you should have your vote. What you believe should be out there, not what they believe, unless you don't have trust in yourself.
Every country, every nation, every society has to have a set of governing regulations that will cause it to not just behave in a certain manner, but to be protected in a certain manner. But generally a constitution, and particularly the Irish Constitution, is a document that confines the state and it protects the people from the state. The people are entitled to have their own legislation that suits the common good that they've enacted by agreeing to have that constitution. But the danger is that if someone, such as the state, were to try to take advantage of certain situations, the constitution protects the people away from any interference, say, by the state. There are certain things set out from cover to cover. It starts off by setting out who we are as a people. It says, for example, in the preamble, that we are a Christian country. It doesn't mean that everyone in the country has to be a Christian. What it says is that according to Christian law, everyone has a sovereign right to their own independence, to their certain liberties and freedoms, and that they must behave in a certain manner in keeping with the common good. The Constitution allows people to rely on the fact that the government cannot make people behave differently to that, for example.
Society is a very complicated thing. It is a combination of individual and community actions. Ideally, the individual, there must be individuals as leaders within a community, otherwise the community stalls, stagnates and eventually dies out. So you definitely do need people who are prepared to be individual and to lead from the front. But you also need, if you want to create a harmonious community, a sense of responsibility for each individual towards every other individual in that community. They're the most successful societies, I would argue, in the long term. What we are doing in the West, and increasingly we're seeing the symptoms here in Ireland, is we're breaking down the community links the links between family members, the links between different people living in the same area or different people in different parts of a nation. We're breaking that down and we're reducing people down to what the philosophers would call the monad, the atomic individual, the single indivisible individual who exists totally independent of everybody else. So it's to ignore his links with anybody else. It's to reduce society down to a collection of atoms. But why? Is that because somebody believes that maybe that's a better way to organise society? Or is it's easier to control society and the people in society that way? I tend to take a more pessimistic view that increasingly we're living in a society which is controlled and governed by an elite for an elite. And any lines of resistance that could come from, say, family solidarity or a sense of community or a sense of even regional identity, they are all being weakened and undermined in order to allow the unelected elite, the real elite, to increasingly control society. We are returning towards what I would consider to be a feudal society. Society based on two distinct classes. A very small elite at the top which controls and decides everything. They have total sovereignty. And then the masses who have no sovereignty, no control, no rights. It is a step backwards. We are in the process of watching society being returned 500 years back to the past.
I think the principal problem of Ireland today is not knowing what the country stands for. What I said earlier about not having Irish, certain values do not define the Irish nation anymore. We're at sea, floating between Britain and America on the one hand and between what Brussels decides is good for us on the other. That's our principal problem today. We don't know, we are not agreed on who we are. And it's very important for people to be agreed on who we are. That's brought off much better, as I say, at local level, where such and such a town, or indeed, in sport terms, such and such a county knows definitely who they are. But we haven't got that for the nation.
I've gone down a lot of rabbit holes and looking at this stuff, and what I've found is that the whole system's really fiction. It's just a corporate system, and its rules and regulations are really fiction. We kind of made it all up. As far as the democratic system goes, I mean, most of what we see as democracy is really an illusion. It's kind of mob rule. Someone made a wonderful quote that democracy is two sheep and a wolf sitting down and deciding what's for dinner. That's what democracy is. Plato described democracy as the least favourable form of government. He rated it below tyranny as a form of government. Now what we have here is we've got a system which gives the people the illusion that they have a choice in what's going on. That's kind of dangerous because people think that they can go and vote and they can actually change things and they've made a difference, but they haven't. They've really forgotten what their relationship between government is. And what we have really in all forms of government, it doesn't matter what country it's in, what we have is actually a relationship that's based on fiduciary trust. Because if we have a democratic system, which is supposedly a government of the people, for the people and by the people, then what we have are a group of public trustees elected to power by the people and given control of what is essentially the administrative arm of our society. These governments, these politicians, they get in control of these governments, they create legislation which gradually locks down society more and more and makes them more subservient to government. And everybody in the society ends up in a state of hardship. They end up in service to their employees, and this is breach of trust. All of it is breach of trust. And the governments are the ones who give the corporate power to the corporations. They give them the same rights as people. The corporations go and trash the world. They're not held accountable for it because it's a corporation. The CEO and the people within the corporation are never accountable. It's the corporation that's accountable. But the corporation is a fiction. All of the laws that allow these fictions to rape the world the way they do are all enacted by government. Again, this is all breach of trust. And it continues because people don't understand what their relationship with government is. They think the government is this all-ruling body because they believe the dictates that have been taught to them by a government-controlled education system. It's a vicious circle. But that's what we're basically facing. The whole New World Order, police state, all of this stuff, whatever you want to call it, Illuminati, whatever you want to call it, it's a global corporation that's been formed which will eventually encompass everything. And its sole purpose is to basically milk the wealth of the planet and steal it from the people. And that's what's happening.
Capitalism's dead. There's no capitalism anymore. It's the bailing out of too big to fail banks. It's corporatism, the merger of state and corporate powers. Capitalism is dead. Long live capitalism. If you're too big, you get money. If you're not too big, you fail. You can't pay your mortgage, you lose your house. You make a bad bet as a bank, you get bailed out by the people. This is not capitalism. Let's get this straight. If it was capitalism, the too big to fails would have failed, banks would have failed, but banks have become sacrosanct. And again, it's not only in banking, it's in virtually every industry. You want to give big corporations a break? Lower that tax rate. Hey, how about Starbucks? You don't need to pay any taxes. It's okay. So of course it's corporatism, but corporatism also equals fascism, as Mussolini said.
The things that psychopaths dislike the most, which they envy in us and they seek to destroy, would be creativity, our imagination, and our compassion. This is why they've taken control of the arts. The arts today are completely psychopathic. I'm talking about the main galleries and stuff, the kind of contemporary arts. It says nothing about the human soul. And that's completely psychopathic because it divorces us of creativity. Science, likewise, science along with creativity. Science and art should be the two greatest pursuits that human beings can undertake. Science has been taken over by the corporations and the government. Scientists are not allowed to create anything unless it serves a commercial or a governmental or a military objective. So two things the psychopathic control grid has taken away is our imagination and creativity. And what that leads to is compassion. The purpose of creativity and the purpose of science should be a compassion and for the humanity, a decency for humanity to make life here better. The exact opposite is happening. Science is being used to destroy us now. Creativity is being used to wreck our consciousness, and it results in us having no compassion. Children playing video games where they murder people is destroying their consciousness to the point where they're losing their compassion. So they're making proto-psychopaths of all of us. And this is the problem. They've taken stewardship of the two most important things, art and science. Because both of those build human consciousness and human society going forward. And when they've taken those things away, we've automatically lost compassion. And this is why we have to deal with the psychopathic problem now.
I told you what to do and you haven't done it. And you're up to your neck in trouble in consequence. I told you in New York, I put it to you very carefully and exactly. I told you that what you had in doing this country was to abolish your constitution, which was preventing you from doing anything. And now you see what's happened since. Every attempt you've made to do anything, the Supreme Court immediately stops it and says it's against the Constitution. Well, I tell you again, get rid of your Constitution. But I suppose you won't do it.
I don't want to punish anybody. But there are an extraordinary number of people whom I want to kill. You must all know half a dozen people at least, who are no use in this world. Who are more trouble than they are worth. Just put them there and say, sir or madam, now will you be kind enough to justify your existence? If you can't justify your existence, if you're not pulling your weight in the social boat, if you're not producing as much as you consume, or perhaps a little more, then clearly we cannot use the big organization of our society for the purpose of keeping you alive, because your life does not benefit us, and it can't be of very much use to yourself.
One thing that I've noticed around Dublin is the rise of the security camera, the CCTV camera. And initially they were brought into certain areas that were known to have security problems, but now they are literally everywhere. For example, at the moment we're in a very peaceful university campus in the centre of Dublin, and yet I can see just over there on the corner of that building there's a security camera. The question is, who or why were those cameras introduced? Now, if we're to confront the people who installed them, they'll say it's to prevent crime. But the reality is, over the past 20 years, we've had more and more cameras installed, and yet the crime rate has continued to rise. So clearly, it is not those who are engaged in or considering engaging in crime or physical assault or any other kind of antisocial behaviour who seem to be bothered by the presence of these cameras. But it is the honest, decent, law-abiding citizen who does feel their actions are being watched, does feel intimidated. And how exactly is that going to influence them subconsciously? And I think that's probably the real reason why we have so many cameras. It is actually as a way of controlling the masses, not the criminals.
That has been made abundantly clear by different court cases. We have many over the history of the state, but particularly the ones that jump to mind would be the Crotty case, the McKenna case, and most recently the fabulous Mark McChrystal victory, where the government, for example, abused funds in what Mark McChrystal showed, and they spent money on promoting their agenda. Mark McChrystal took that case to court under the Constitution, and albeit that he lost in the High Court, when he then subsequently appealed it to the Supreme Court, which is the only court really where you can bring matters about constitutionality of certain actions, the court had to find with him. They said that the government had to be unbiased in the presentation of facts, remembering that the government in the first place cannot bring anything of their own volition. It has to come from the people. And what was very strange about that situation is that the people clearly did not realise that the government had been promoting a certain agenda. And although the people voted in favour of the amendment, the court still found that they were promoted to vote a certain way because money was taken from public coffers, belonged to the people, not belonged to the politicians, and used in a divisive way to cause a certain result. So even though the people had exercised their constitutional right to vote, Mark McChrystal was entitled to go back and show that they were cajoled, they were fooled into making what he believed was an invalid decision because the people were not given a fair chance to hear both sides of the story. So that's the power of a constitution.
Yeah, sure you can. Just step in here. Hold on. Get in front of me there.
2 seconds. Okay, well, is everybody okay? What would you like to say?
We just had a clear and unanimous decision by the Supreme Court. The state has been unfair in this referendum, using taxpayers' money to get a yes vote in this referendum, leaving voters uninformed about what this referendum is really about, and the state taking over parental rights and harming the family. I want to thank the judges, my legal team, and all the support I received.
Are you going to try and actually stop the referendum on Saturday? Or
I can't discuss that now.
Mark,
what was it about the campaign itself that you took particular issue with?
Government publications, for example, were incorrect. There's been little effort or no effort to actually make corrections. So people should pay careful attention now at this stage to the government use their the taxpayers' money in a way which is not consistent with a free and open democracy.
Do you think it's one of the examples, one of the particular sentences, or that you feel was particularly imbalanced?
There's a number of threats which were mentioned in the case. I'm not going to go with them now.
Can we rely on the outcome of this referendum now? Will it be a safe referendum, the outcome? I'm
personally quite doubtful, and people should pay attention. Again, in a serious situation like the referendum, that if the government can't be trusted in this regard, what can they be trusted with,
Mark, would you describe yourself as a no campaigner?
I'm a person with a track record of concerns about the way the government treats families and the Irish people.
In terms of the McKenna principles, is there scope for them going forward? Is it time to have a whole rethink of how we inform people ahead of referendums?
The McKenna judgment was very, very clear to protect the rights of the Irish people, and also to put a limit on the way the government behaves. And there's been a great slippage in that area in the wrong direction. So hopefully the government will pay careful attention now to this judgment today.
In terms of costs, will you be applying for your costs? Will the state have to pay for this challenge?
As far as I know, the state will take care of that in this area, because I did take it on behalf of the Irish people.
It wasn't for any personal gain. In each of those cases, the government lost. They lost to the people because of the power of the Constitution. The Constitution identifies two very important facts: that the people are the sovereign owners of the country. The sovereignty, according to the preamble, that the people have comes directly from God. It says in the preamble, in the name of the Blessed Trinity. The last words in the Constitution said, for the glory of God. So we declare that we have an honourable right to our nation, to our nationality, and to the sovereign rights that we use to enact those things. When they're interfered with, we can use that very book to go back and remind the politicians and the state that they're employees. They must do what they're told. If they don't behave in that way, then the court has the right to interfere. Therefore, the Constitution is the ultimate document that everybody should not just understand, but should own, should have in their possession, and should use regularly. It would save so much hassle, because politicians are relying on the fact that people will not spend the €3 that's necessary to buy it. People don't understand it, and because they don't understand, politicians take advantage, and the state, offices of the state, take advantage of the fact that people don't know what their sovereign rights are. People are led to believe, for example, that there was a sovereign debt. Sovereignty has nothing to do with money, because God didn't invent money. He didn't want to create money as such. He gave us our own free will, and we've chosen to do that. The sovereignty issue is that the people cannot be interfered with. When they say sovereign debt, they're actually they're purposely confusing words. Our sovereignty is a very clear way of saying our fundamental rights. The government cannot interfere with our fundamental rights, and our sovereignty is defined in the Constitution that declares that clearly and openly. It is the one thing that the government and the state cannot circumvent. So it's a vital document.
It's about state control of children. It's about the ending of parental rights to make decisions, good parents to make decisions for their children. And the state knew it, and they instead just gave, the mythical version of what this referendum is about. Unfortunately, the referendum is on Saturday. People have been badly misinformed, at their own expense, and it begs huge questions. So I would say to anyone, vote no. Absolutely vote no in this referendum and demand answers for why they were lied to.
Where to from here, Kathy?
Where to from here? Well, hopefully the referendum will be defeated, that good parents will keep their rights to raise their children, make decisions for them. And then I think all of us in this country have to get on the case of the state, have to insist that children will be treated properly. And we also have to open up the secret courts, the in-camera courts, so that all children, all families are treated properly in this country. I mean, the very contempt that the state showed for the voters in producing one-sided leaflets has now been exposed by the Supreme Court, all 5 justices. And that same contempt is the kind of contempt they hold us, the voters, in, that they hold families and they hold children in. So I think hopefully this will bring about a defeat of the referendum, and then we have to commit ourselves to children.
If Saturday produces a yes vote, will you be looking at legal options?
If Saturday, I don't know about that yet. I'm still working for a no. The Irish people are wise. We've been stripped of our money, we've been stripped of our jobs, but I tell you, Irish people are not going to be stripped of their children.
It has to happen only because, quite clearly, some natural laws are at work here. It has to happen because if a lot of the pillars that we once relied upon were sustainable, built on natural laws that themselves were built on ethics that were in some way sustainable, if they were truly sustainable, then they wouldn't be collapsing. So in other words, they just have to collapse, and we have to endure the burden and the pain of it. Now, that doesn't make us feel better, but once you begin to accept that it had to happen, then what you have potential for is understanding of the misfortune and the bad luck to be alive when all of this is happening. and go beyond the experience of disappointment, to go beyond the experience of bad luck, to go into the required anger, and to go beyond the anger, to go into a place where your will can participate in the outcome, where your will can participate in how perhaps we have the possibility to make things more sustainable. I hear some people talk about, I really wish for the restoration of things today to the way they were 5 or 10 years ago. And part of me understands that, of course, because back then people maybe weren't having the same problem, particularly financially. But what was stable for them 5, 10 years ago quite clearly wasn't sustainable. Otherwise, we wouldn't be experiencing what we're experiencing now in 2013. So we need to wish for things to be different. And if you feel your will can participate in the positive change that quite clearly has been called for, then all of a sudden your life has a whole different meaning. And the sense of energy that you can find to engage in the hardship, to engage in the hard work that's asked for to create positive change, if you feel your will is participating, then you will be able to find far more energy than somebody who feels their will is either extinguished or has no place or is being neglected. And we can't wait for others to say your will is involved. We can't wait for others to say it's okay for you to vote in a certain kind of way. We actually have to come and declare that for ourselves. And for me, this is a very important issue because we're living in a generation of immense opportunity where a lot of this collapse is actually the early stages of an emergence. How sustainable and how intelligent that new emergence will be, I can't say, but all I know is that we have the potential. And you've got to keep your eye on that side of the affairs as much as the destruction and the crumbling, because if you just look at one side, you won't be balanced, but also keeping an eye on the future, keeping an eye on the possibilities, keeping an eye on what's our potentiality, allows you to find an avenue for your creative energies, for your anger to be turned into something productive. As I said, like for your will to actually participate.
I think with this economic situation, crisis, in both faith and politically and financially, I think we have treasure to mine. So for many people, it's complete overwhelm because it seems to be so much at the one time. But having lived in Ireland all my life, and I've known a place where I felt that the people in authority, the priest or the politician or the banker or the teacher, where I felt childlike and I trusted implicitly that the people in charge, who were usually male, knew what they were doing. So I didn't take responsibility. And as I grew up, I began to question, well, why are we doing what they're saying? Does that suit me? Does that resonate with me or not? And I think when all the old orders started to crumble, not just here in Ireland, but over the world, that it has forced us as human beings into a situation where we need to look at those orders, and they're not serving us anymore. So from many different paths that I've followed, I've come to a place of knowing deep within my body, within my heart, what resonates for me or not. So within that there's codes of ethics, I suppose you'd call them. I mean, killing somebody, stealing something, all the basics just feel so alien to me. But at the same time, I'm not naive enough to think that in any given situation I might. If somebody was going to hurt my children, maybe I would kill. If I was starving and my loved ones are starving, maybe I'd steal. So from a place of non-judgment, to question all, but to grow up from that childlike state and to realize that if I accept my sovereignty, I must take the responsibility that goes with it.
The systems that are collapsing are not eternal. Some of them were only invented a couple of hundred years ago. So we're not seeing the collapse of something that is ordained or God-given. What we're seeing is the collapse of things that human beings have made. Therefore, human beings can make the next model hopefully more intelligent, hopefully more sustainable. But to participate for me is the key, because when I meet people who feel they can't participate, they don't have a right, or they've actually stepped back into victimhood or into a place of apathy. And that is the rationale for them not participating. I do see in those people more despair, more depression, and deep down sadness. And that's understandable, but that's not going to be the place from which we can work personally, individually, and collectively as a community to recover and potentially make things better. And all things have a natural cycle. And a lot of the cycles of the institutions that are collapsing, their cycles are simply over. And we're living in extraordinary times because there's a number of those cycles all collapsing at the same time. So it's a real deep opportunity to remember how we want to live as a species. It's a real time to perhaps renew ourselves and to start all over again. And perhaps that's as it needs to be.
So what would I say to anybody from any different background? Come to know yourself. Be with the pain or the sorrow or the chaos or the overwhelm that's going on, whatever your situation. And reach out to others who are coming through it. So you might see somebody who, gosh, they lost their house, but they look like they're doing okay. So what are you doing? Oh, mindfulness, maybe I'll try that. Oh, somebody in your family died young from suicide, but you seem to be working through it. Oh, it's your faith. Does that resonate with me or not? So in other words, there are many ways to that spiritual sovereign self within. We have everything here we need, but sometimes difficult circumstances, like what's going on at the moment externally, almost forces us into that place, and we can be stuck in it and bitter and twisted, or we can choose to release, to own our part in it. What have I done in my life that I got to the situation where I want a Prada handbag worth $5,000? And I'm defined by it. And do I have £5,000 to spare that I can spend in a handbag and I really appreciate it? Or am I defined by it? Maybe, maybe not. So there's nothing inherently wrong with a handbag unless your self-worth is dependent on it, or to be part of mainstream, I must have the right genes and the right look and I must be young. To trust our own instincts and to know that whatever path brings us to that place is good, and to be with that sense of inner sovereignty. And to me, that would automatically bring me to a spiritual place. And I recognize that my spiritual path might not be somebody else's, but I honor theirs, no judgment, as I would hope they might to me. But if they don't, that's okay too.
Well, I think the ordinary person first has to understand what democracy is. It has to have an appreciation for democracy. Because the reason we have this democracy is that our forefathers, those who came before us, went through great suffering and pain to achieve it, to get the democracy. Because before you had the democracy, you were under tyranny. You were living under tyranny. You were a second-class citizen in your own country. And the people suffered greatly. And revolution always comes about because one day you wake up and you go, you know what? It's really bad. I can't live another day under this tyranny. I would rather resist and fight back, because I would probably suffer less if I did that. I would feel better about myself than to live another day of this. And so when you actually look into that, when you actually look into it, and you begin to realize what was what the great cost that was paid by our ancestors. And we have pictures of them on postage stamps, and we have bronze heads and statues and plazas, you know. But in reality, we have to understand that what has happened is, what a democracy is that we have the power of kings and queens, where that power was previously vested in one person, right? And reinforced by all their armies, you know, and their resources. That power is now vested in the people. So each one of us, you, me, every single person watching this video, every person in the country, is a small piece or part of the sovereign, a little unit in a big sovereign. We are the sovereign together. And what did we do? We said, wow, we are the sovereign now. The state of Ireland that used to be owned by the sovereign and controlled by the sovereign is ours now. The entire thing, all the wealth, everything belongs to us. And what are we going to do? Well, what they did was they created the first Irish Free State Constitution, and they decided to make the best constitution they possibly could have. And they said, well, you know, and to manage all this, we can't do this all together. What we need to have is, we need to have representatives to manage it for us, so that we can have the most incredible, you know, life, that we can have an abundant life and happiness, and raise our families and enjoy the beauty of Ireland, right? And so we created the representative form of government, you know. So if you understand that everything of what a democracy is, you know, that through the Constitution we cede powers to our representatives who are public servants, who manage the affairs of the state for us, so that we can be free and be happy and enjoy our lives, right? So once you appreciate that, and you go like, and then you look into the history of the state, and you realize that not only did we have that form of government like all the other governments have in the world, we also had two articles, Article 47 and 48, which gave us direct democracy, where we said, even though we're going to allow the representatives to rule and manage our affairs for us, what we're going to do is we're going to let them do what they want. But should they ever not do what we want to have the right to step in and create a referendum, initiate a referendum to actually change what they're doing. So therefore, we actually guarantee success. We guarantee a future of abundance and happiness for us. And so fast forward to today, we realize now that they've taken those articles out of the Constitution, and we have an economy that has collapsed. We have a banking system that has collapsed. We're experiencing higher taxes now, and including a property tax, and more and more as they keep taxing us and coming up with new and innovative ways to tax us, more and more we're becoming unhappy. So the average citizen needs to realize that they don't have to put up with this, because the way it is now, if you go against the state and decide not to pay those taxes, then they can fine you, and they can throw the book at you. They can make it illegal what you're doing. However, if the people come together and organize themselves around direct democracy and elect people to the Oireachtas who believe in direct democracy and put those articles back in the Constitution, then the people of Ireland can have a referendum on anything they want, including the property tax. And if the people of Ireland do not want to have a property tax, the only way that they can effectively really push back legally is by implementing direct democracy. And so the people need to realize that if they want to live the life they want to live in Ireland, and they want to stop being outraged by all of the things that are going on with the banking system and the economy and the taxation and the benefits that a few powerful elite are getting, then they need to implement direct democracy. They need to come together and talk about this and understand what it is and organize themselves to implement it here in Ireland.
The reason I'm for direct democracy is because the representative governments only represent the most powerful and the richest. People that give them the most amount of money or tell them what to do. So why should you have a small group of people telling the rest of society what they should do when they're only representing the few people that pay for their campaigns and keep them in power? So this is not a representative form of democracy. It's a joke. As I'm here today on Election Day USA, all you have to do is look over there to see what a joke and farce it all is. We have a lesser of two evils election. But who wants to vote for a lesser of two evils? The God I believe in would call it a sin if you voted for an evil, lesser or greater, because the outcome is evil. So you really don't have any choices. These aren't democracies. These aren't representative form of governments. They're mafias, but they have political names on them to make them sound proper. So direct democracy puts the future back in the hands of the people. If you want to go to war, let the people vote. Ask them. If you want to bail out the banks, ask the people, because certainly the leaders don't know what they're talking about. They keep failing their way through. Everything they've done since the Panic of 08 has hit has been an abject failure, and the only people that are paying for it are the people who have no voice in it. So give the people a voice. This is the 21st century. This is not a medieval time, although we're being treated like peasants and serfs. Let the people vote.
The good news is that this is simple to fix. It's something that everyone can understand. And that is, we have to do two things. Number one, you have to prevent your government from borrowing. No sovereign nation should be ever allowed to borrow anything from anybody. The only exception of that is nations can issue bonds to merely for the purpose of the people of the nation having a safe place to save their money. But as far as issuing bonds and selling them off in the marketplace in mass, then that just leaves you open to attack by the banker class. So the bankers end up buying the bonds because they have the most money, and thereby they essentially take over government, and your government is no longer sovereign, and that's what the problem is right now. So, and until we eliminate that ability of a nation state to borrow money, we're never going to be able to get effective legislation through on anything else as far as the banking community goes. So that's really step number one. And then step number two is to eliminate the ability of the banks to practice fractional reserve lending, which is essentially nothing but counterfeiting of the national money. And it gives them magnifies their power because they have the ability to essentially create money out of nothing. When you go to your bank and you get a mortgage to buy a house, the bank doesn't go back in the back room and pull out a big bag of money and give it to you. It just enters digits into a computer. And so at that instant, they are literally creating the national money, but they're not creating it without debt. They are creating it as an interest-bearing debt. So it's fair to say that the vast majority of every national money in the world at this point is created as an interest-bearing debt, instead of the way it should be, where governments should create their own money without debt and then lend it to banks, instead of the way it is now, where banks are on top. Banks lend all money to government, and it goes from that direction, and it puts banks on the top of the pile. It makes banks the sovereign instead of the state being the sovereign.
So, you take Switzerland, for example. Nice place to live, highest quality of life in the world, haven't been in a war since about the 1850s, food's real good, everything's nice and clean, everybody has guns, and they don't kill each other. Yeah, it works. Look what Iceland did. Rather than like Ireland and the other countries around Europe that bent over and got shafted when they had to bail out the banks, the the Icelandic people said, no, we're not going to bail out the banks. They made bad bets, they lose. Screw you. And now they're getting back on their feet while the rest of Europe continues to go down.
This referendum is a very strong statement from the general public in Iceland saying we refuse to take socialized private debt. And what this will mean for Europe is, and other countries in the world, and that is why very many nations are trying to stop this referendum happening behind the scenes, is that they fear that this will set an example, for example, in Greece. Because people are sick of this. They are really sick of having to take on private debt, especially from the banksters. So maybe we will encourage others to do exactly this. And maybe this will encourage the financial sector to stop being such leeches on the general public.
You are proposing to renege on debt, renege on loans made to you.
Well, loans that we never asked for, and we didn't, like most of people in Iceland had no idea about this deal until we were supposed to fork out for it. There are 317,000 people living in Iceland. There were 300-something thousand accounts, ISIF accounts. Each person in Iceland is responsible for 21,000 euros. Okay, we might not pay it directly, but we will pay it by like 80,000 Icelanders will pay their income tax on only the interest of this loan that we never asked for. And for me, representing the nation here in Parliament, this is completely unacceptable.
It wasn't the time to say that before the great crash. Wasn't the time to say...
A lot of people tried to say that.
But the point is that those banks thrived, seemed to be thriving. It was all on borrowed money, but they seemed to be thriving in a financial system which should have underwritten them.
Well,
and the time to say we can't underwrite these banks was then, not now.
Well, people did say that. Most of the media was owned by the oligarchs that owned the banks. The banks were only privatized 5 years prior to the crash. In 5 years, the Independence Party ruling the Icelandic country...
Elected by the Icelandic people.
Not all Icelandic people.
Well, the argument is that the people elect a government, and your government of the time never put those things in place. It never underwrote those banks.
Hang on. This is not true, because it was not. This is a classic thing for the financial sector. That this was a bank in England and the UK, and there was also a bank in Germany. Yes. Why did none of these countries stop these banks going into their territory?
The home government, an elected government here in Reykjavik, in this building, was thought to be responsible for its own banks.
Of course, it is partially responsible. That's why we take
so
1/3 of
money.
No, we take 1/3 of the risk with this, and then the UK and the Dutch, they take the rest of the risk because their own legislation failed as well. Why should we carry their baggage?
I'm trying to understand the anger here. I'm quite surprised.
Oh, well, the anger is very simple.
I don't mean with you, but I mean other people.
No. It's quite simple. The UK government put the Terrorist Act on Icelanders while we're down. That is where the anger comes from. To freeze funds, but they put us on their website, side by side to Al-Qaeda, side by side to Zimbabwe. We were there on that website with all the main terrorist states in the world. And this not only, they only froze the assets of Landsbanki, however, what it did, it stopped all credit lines to Iceland. We were facing not getting food, not getting medication, forced into an IMF program. They were experimenting. We're a small country. However, don't forget, we're the first country that this brutal force is used on. This is economic warfare.
We're here on the site of Þingvellir. This is the place in Iceland, we're actually in Iceland right now, where all the various tribes came together of Iceland to discuss a constitutional assembly, and also they actually created their first constitution here. And Iceland was quite enlightened. They traveled around a bit and went to Norway in the initial 900s, 800s, and tried to find out what their laws were. And then they implemented their version of it. They used to meet here on a yearly basis, more than 1,000 years ago. And they created their first constitution here. And the Icelandic constitution actually has the power of referendum in the constitution, but it has never been used until recently. And they had a governmental, economic, and constitutional crisis here. in Iceland. That's why we're here in Iceland, because we've been working with the Icelandic government, the Department of the Interior, the President of Iceland, the Constitutional Committee, various groups, Democracy International, International Referendum Institute, and we're here to help them think through how they can improve their constitution. Now, they did have direct democracy, a version of it, the idea that people could ask for a referendum that could gather signatures, but that power actually was with the president of Iceland, not with the people. They gathered the signatures and asked the president to schedule a referendum. That is known as a plebiscite. That means that the government actually has the power to schedule a referendum. So this was never used before until recently, where the people of Ireland, the people of Ireland bailed out the bankers, and in Iceland, the people of Iceland had a referendum called the IceSave referendum, where they asked the people whether they should bail out the bankers or not.
The British government paid out more than £2 billion in compensation last year to British savers who had money invested in Iceland's banks when they collapsed. But now the Icelandic president has blocked moves to pay back the money it owes Britain after public protests there. Instead, he has called a referendum so that the people can decide. Our deputy political editor James Landau reports.
Iceland, land of volcanoes and warm springs, but today risking glacial relations with Britain and being frozen out of the international financial community. Why? Well, it goes back to the financial crisis in 2008 when Iceland's banks collapsed. Thousands of British savers with IceSave saw their money frozen. The British government bailed them out, but wants Reykjavik to repay the £2.3 billion that it cost. Iceland's government and parliament agreed to repay the money, but 1 in 4 Icelanders queued up last week to sign a petition opposing the move, which they say they can't afford and could risk economic recovery. Their president agrees and today refused to sign off the deal and triggered a possible referendum.
Recently it's become more clear that the nation needs to be convinced that it's the nation itself that decides the outcome.
It was always going to be a close vote. The polls were just too marginal to be definitive. And the relief at the Party for the No campaign was voiced as each preliminary result was announced.
It seems Iceland doesn't want to pay for the sins of its bankers.
Campaigners here say other countries should take notice of what's happened here. There's a $5 billion bill left by the collapse of Landsbanki in 2008. Its internet outfit IceSave left thousands of British and Dutch customers out of pocket. But Iceland's government admits it couldn't convince the people that they should pick up some of that tab. This no vote will probably mean a lengthy court battle over liability with the British and Dutch governments.
Now, I spoke with some Icelandic people here, and they said that with all the scare tactics we use, if you don't bail out the banks, everything's going to fall apart, nobody's going to have a job anymore, the economy's going to fall apart. And then when I asked them, well, did that really happen? They said no. They said they lied to us. Even though the people here decided that they weren't going to pay the bankers and stepped into the unknown, they figured out it was a huge manipulation and a huge lie.
4 years ago, Icelanders were angry. Banks' emblems were burned in the street. People worried they would lose their houses, their savings. The country felt isolated. After 90 years of independence, Iceland applied to join the European Union. 4 years later, the sun is shining on Iceland. It's the EU that seems a darker, less attractive place. Though it's still government policy to join, most citizens say they're no longer in favour.
I don't want to give our currency away and all that, because it's kind of romantic that we're so small.
I really want us to have our Icelandic krona, not the stupid euro.
The then Prime Minister Gordon Brown opened a diplomatic wound between London and Reykjavik in 2008 when he invoked anti-terror laws to seize all Icelandic financial assets.
Well, what happened in Iceland is completely unacceptable.
Iceland is basically in a situation where we are similar to Cuba. There's basically a trade embargo on Iceland because Mr. Gordon Brown has imposed an anti-terrorist law against us. We are in the situation that no money can be transferred either in or out or out of Iceland.
Or more profoundly disappointed and sad that the government of this enlightened country should in the October of 2008 decide on two things. One was to employ the terrorist legislation which was created to defend against Al-Qaeda and Taliban against Iceland and put my country, the government and the entire system on the official website, the British government website, side by side with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And the second thing was that Gordon Brown in October and Alistair Darling went on global television, including CNN, and stated that Iceland was a bankrupt country, which was utter nonsense at its best, financial terrorism on their part at its worst. And this meant that companies all over the world who had dealings with Iceland closed their operation down, so the British damaged our economy to a greater extent than otherwise would have been the case.
Back in 2008, Iceland let its banks default on debts they could not honour. It meant the state had more financial leeway to increase pensions, jobless benefits and home loan reliefs to a society in shock. Many Icelanders now view the EU and the Eurozone with horror. They see countries like Greece, which are stuck with high debts, high unemployment, and economies still in recession. They see pharmacies running out of stocks. Iceland is not the only country to be moving away from the EU. Turkey's application, already 25 years old, is slipping further away. Serbia, Macedonia and Montenegro's applications all face obstacles too. Croatia will join the 27-country club next year, but if Iceland's government decides to follow its people's will, that could be it for a very long time.
Hey, guess what country is getting itself out of a financial hole by some rather draconian measures?
Well, Greece?
No, not even close. Iceland.
Iceland?
Iceland. They are putting people in jail. They are putting, like, prime ministers being indicted. They're going after bankers. The people said, yeah, I said, those banks were ripping us off. We don't like what they did. They brought our country to ruin. And now Iceland suddenly is turning around. Their GDP is growing, and they look like a big success story. Isn't that mean?
In our case, we decided to let the banks fail. They were private banks. And as I've sometimes said, I have never understood why somehow banks are the holy churches of the modern economy, whereas it is normal to let other companies go bankrupt and fail. Suddenly, when a bank is in trouble, everybody comes rushing and says, no, this can't happen. Some people say we didn't have the money to keep them going. To some extent, that is true. But it was also a part of a comprehensive policy where on many other issues we went against the orthodox financial view prevailing in the United States and Europe. And now, 4 years later or so, Iceland is recovering in a remarkable way. We have 3% economic growth, we have 5% unemployment, the state finances are in a reasonable shape. So by going against the established orthodox views prevailing in the US and Europe, we actually managed to create a recovery which is quite remarkable.
So you didn't look at the banks as these golden children that needed to be protected and coddled and saved?
No, absolutely not. These were private companies operating fundamentally like private companies, rewarding the bankers and the shareholders. So why, when they fail, should ordinary people, taxpayers, teachers, nurses, workers, pay the price and bear the burden?
In the past few decades, the country has maximised its natural resources and weaned itself off oil, saving over $8 billion. Now Iceland plans to become fully energy independent by the year 2050.
What is being paid out are from the assets of this failed private bank, because despite it going bust, it turned out to have sufficient assets to cover what was paid out by the British and the Dutch. So in the proper way, as the capitalist system should function, it was the failed estate that was made responsible, but not the ordinary people of my country. But if you go back to our first conversation on this issue about 4 years ago. And you should remember that at that time, every government in the European Union was arguing that Iceland, the people of Iceland, the nation, should be made responsible for the debts of this failed private bank. But now events have shown that that argument, supported by every institution within the European Union, turned out to be economically wrong, democratically wrong, and by the judgment of the EFTA Court, also judicially wrong within the European legal framework.
Travelling around the most beautiful spots on Earth, there's one thing I always wonder about. What is, for humanity, the ideal savings account? I think it's one that offers the highest possible interest rate without any conditions, no snags. So a savings bank that's completely transparent, which is exactly what I found. And its name is iSave. Right. In fact, iSave is completely transparent, including the website. Because iSave's an online savings bank, completely dummy-proof. Also transparent, an award for best online savings account in the UK. Excuse me, the loo? Ah, over there.
I want to talk about the bondholders that were bailed out by us, by the taxpayer. We bailed out 34 billion of taxpayers' money. Basically went to the likes of one of the richest families in the world, the Rothschilds. We also bailed out Goldman Sachs. Now, what we should have done was followed Iceland's example, where they burnt the bondholders, they're defaulting on the original debt. They said no to the EU and the IMF, and they're on the road to recovery. They're exiting the recession. Now, we have trillions of euros worth of oil and gas off the west coast of this country, which could solve our financial problems in a very short period of time, which corrupt ministers in our government gave away. We need to nationalise them.
We don't know. See, if you start doing that now, Jim.
Direct democracy will give people their own lives rather than have other people tell them how they should live it. And it would prevent countries from becoming involved in other people's business. Because if you ask people to go to war and they have to go and they're voting on it, guess what? They're not going to go. If you put on the referendum, do you want to go to war? And if we're going to go to war, you're going to send yourself, your wife, your kids, and your money. See how far the vote goes. So what direct democracy does, it builds nations stronger because the people are looking out for their community. I'm not talking about nationalism in a xenophobic sense. I'm talking about self-preservation. Nobody takes care of you but yourself. And every nation should take care of its people. And by the people all joining together to chart its future and having their collective voice, to me, that's the best way to move forward.
Say you want a revolution, we better get on right away. Better get on your feet and out on the street, singing power to the people. Power to the people. Come on, song. Power to the people. Power to the people, right on. A million workers working.
It took me like maybe 10 days to figure out 3 demand claims. Like the government should step down, the board of the National Bank should step down, and the board of the Money Supervisory Authority should step down. Then I went around asking people from different political groups, and I asked, could you agree on these 3 demands? And they said, yeah, plus this and this and that. And I said, okay, one thing at a time. Let's do these 3, and if we achieve to get these 3 things done, then we can find another one, or next 3. Take it step by step. And in the 3rd or 4th big meeting, this is what I asked the crowd. Do you want the government to resign? Do you want the board of the National Bank to resign and the money supervisory authorities? And they said, thousands of people said yes. And I knew then, that moment, this is the glue. This is what we have to fight for. So it was always peaceful demonstration, these 3 demands, and do you want another meeting a week from now? And please don't litter, don't leave anything on the ground when you leave. And that was perfect, it was always very clean. So this is what I started out with, and this is what we achieved in 5 months. Many of the things that happened in Iceland was because of what the citizens did, like the big protest. And we were just putting a pressure on the politicians. One of the things was there was a man who had been in France, I think, but he had heard or he knew of a woman. She's actually Norwegian. She lives in Norway. Her name is Eva Jolie. She is an investigator in financial fraud with a very good results in France. And this guy, his name is Jon Thorisson, he contacted Eva Jolie in France and brought her to Iceland and introduced her to the government, to the Prime Minister. The purpose was to establish a special investigator office to investigate the financial crimes and the financial situation. And the government accepted to hire Eva Jolie as an advisor, and the government established this special investigator in crimes, financial crimes. And it's still working. So it wasn't the politicians who did this. This is done by citizens. So many things like that were happening in Iceland at that time, and still I think they are. You know, people are really working on trying to improve the situation and protesting what's going on, especially with the financial, with the banks and money people.
I'm committed to the Irish Revolution, absolutely. I have not seen it realized, but I'm committed to it. Culturally, it goes without saying politically, but also culturally, the Irish Revolution aimed at making Ireland a nation which would be self-governing politically and intellectually, and have a homemade culture, not simply a reflection of cultures in America and Britain. In other words, running itself in every sense, from politics to intellect to culture, distinct among the nations, as distinct, let us say, as Denmark is. And of course it was a terrible misfortune that the language revival did not succeed. Because to have a language, to be speaking a language of your own, is the first definition of a nation.
My view is like, I belong to a society. You can look at it as an Icelandic society, and also Iceland belongs to this world. To me, as a human, you have to participate in your society. You cannot just breathe and live your life leaving the work to others. It's something we have to work on together. We must debate, we must be aware of what's going on. The fact is, if you want to use the word evil, there are people in this world who are very selfish and very greedy. And greed, to me, is a sickness, a very serious sickness. And they are very ruthless. What they want is more, more, and more. And they take everything away from you unless you do something about it. And we are talking about, not only are talking about your home, your life, it's also nature. They are ruining our planet. And it seems to be like many of those people think that life is plenty of people, so let's kill few, it doesn't matter. You have to like fight this with reasons and the law. You have to do this peacefully. And like I've said before, it's a marathon. It's a job for your whole life. It's nothing that you can do just today and that's it. You have to be aware of what's going on. And it's a fight. And it's to me, it's a duty, actually. There's no question about it. I'm not going to walk around here and look at people destroying my life or other people's life without reacting to it. And that's simply my message. Do something. But maybe not doing just something. I mean, find people who are working on this as well. Use reasons. Stay within the law, and if the laws are wrong, we change them. Life means constant changes. Death means it's gone. While you're alive, use your life. Use your life to share with other people. And the main thing, the main message is to every human, every living thing on earth is always love. It's a very simple message. Because a life without love, it's not life. So, fight it. Activate yourself.
On the 11th of July 1921, a ceasefire was formally signed between members of the Dáil Cabinet and the British military commander in Ireland. This was the first step towards securing and maintaining the rights and liberties common to the whole people of Ireland since the formation of the Irish Volunteers in October 1913 and the armed insurrection during the Easter week in 1916. On the 6th of December, Arthur Griffith and Michael Collins signed the Anglo-Irish Treaty in London, which provided for the establishment of the Irish Free State as a self-governing dominion within the British Commonwealth of Nations. On January 7, 1922, Dáil Éireann voted 64 in favour and 57 against. In the aftermath of the treaty vote, Eamon de Valera resigned his post specifically over the required oath of allegiance to the Crown, and his supporters boycotted the Dáil, dividing the Irish government into opposing sides. As the Anglo-Irish Treaty gained momentum, talks of civil war began to emerge. On the 14th of April, the four courts were occupied and became the headquarters of Republican forces led by Rory O'Connor, who opposed the Anglo-Irish Treaty. According to the book Michael Collins by Tim Pat Coogan, in the hope for uniting pro- and anti-treaty forces, Michael Collins selected 7 men to form a group called the Constitution Committee to produce a constitution for the Irish Free State which would be both acceptable to the British and Republicans and enough to prevent civil war. In the first meeting on the 25th of January at the Shelbourne Hotel in Dublin, Michael Collins, as chairman, instructed the committee to create a true democratic constitution. It was to contain not the legalities of the past, but the practicalities of the future. It was to be short, simple and easy to alter as the final stages of complete freedom were achieved, and that there should be no suggestion in the constitution that any power in Ireland derived from the Crown. Therefore, the oath should be left out. The new constitution must be one which would guarantee Ireland's equality of status, not only within the British Empire, but amongst all the nations of the world. Michael Collins was held ultimately responsible for the drafting of the constitution, and due to his other commitments, he allowed the secretary of the committee, Darrell Edmund Vickers, to act in his stead. The utmost task for the constitution makers was to prescribe a permanent independent structure to represent, protect and reflect the desires of each Irish citizen. Darrell Figgis, a prominent Irish writer and activist, worked collectively with the committee on the philosophy of Ireland's ancient Gaelic state, as well as creating a clause to peacefully retain and cater for these changes through a modern mechanism called the Citizens' Initiative, which was gracefully inspired by the unshackled constitution of Switzerland and the people who then had at least up to 90 years of solid continuous practice behind them. Also known as direct democracy, was contained in Articles 47 and 48 and drafted into the Constitution of the Irish Free State. In Switzerland, every year on the first Sunday in May, voters of Canton Claris gather for their Citizens' Assembly. For the last 700 years, the Assembly has decided in open air and in a true democratic fashion on their constitution, the legislation and taxes, as well as important day-to-day issues. Everyone with the right to vote is entitled not only to make a statement on any issue, but also to propose an amendment. As a result, the Citizens' Assembly in Canton Claris often acts as a trendsetter. In this way, the eligible voting age was lowered to 16 and the former 25 villages were promptly merged into 3 core municipalities. Each motion made by its citizens passes through various stages of authorization until it reaches the Citizens' Assembly, where it is discussed and voted upon. After 27 meetings, 3 drafts were made and submitted to the Provisional Government on the 7th of March. Overall, they were an accurate representation of Collins' original aspirations. All were short, uncomplicated and general rather than too detailed and avoided references to British authority. Running as an independent candidate during the general elections, Darrell Figgis said during his speeches that a government will be formed in June and that the people will be making a choice between war and peace, order and anarchy, between the development of a state and nation and the return to futile struggle. On the 4th of May, the leaders of the pro- and anti-treaty forces met to discuss an agreement. A truce was declared with the view to allowing the Dáil Committee to bring their work on the Constitution to completion. On the 20th of May, Eamon de Valera and Michael Collins worked out a pact and agreed that the pro- and anti-treaty factions would fight the general election jointly and form a coalition government afterwards. Draft B, the work of Hugh Kennedy, James Douglas and Clement France, was eventually chosen and brought to London to be presented to the British authorities by Michael Collins. At first sight, the draft constitution struck Winston Churchill and Lloyd George as a complete evasion and complete negation of the treaty. Lloyd George said it was substantially a setting up of an independent republic in Ireland. The Crown was only brought in under conditions very derogatory to its dignity. The court, which constitutes the Empire, was expressly excluded. The British Empire was ruled out from the makings of the treaties altogether. The constitution was a complete going back on the provisions of the treaty. On the 31st of May, Winston Churchill sent a statement to Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson saying, "I have been asked by honourable members who are in agreement with the honourable and gallant member for North Down, Sir Henry Wilson, whether we will tolerate the setting up of a republic. I have been asked to give an assurance on that point. I have said no, we will not do so. In the event of the setting up of a republic, it will be the intention of the government to hold Dublin as one of the preliminary and essential steps in military operations." Sir Henry Wilson replied, "Now we know that the troops in Dublin are being kept in Dublin in order to go to war with the Republic if a Republic be established." Sadly, whatever slight hope of avoiding the Irish Civil War had evaporated, and the constitution on which Collins had pinned such hopes ended up being so altered as to bring it back into conformity with the treaty. On the 12th of June, he went immediately to London to try and change Churchill's mind. Afterwards, in despair, he travelled straight to Cork for solace. The next day, Dublin newspapers reported an assault on Darrell Figgis and his wife. The Evening Herald said that shortly before midnight, Millie Figgis had answered a knock at the door. 3 men rushed past her seeking out her husband. Mrs. Figgis, fearing they had come to shoot her troublesome husband, attempted to block their way and was roughly treated by the gang, who then smashed down the door to the study, held down Mr. Figgis and cut off one half of his beard. On the morning of polling day, the Irish independent newspapers carried a small book titled The Irish Constitution Explained, written during the formation of the Constitution by Darrell Figgis and detailing the noble aspects of the committee's vision and constructive thought for the future, focusing on its readers who hoped it would be one of independence, democracy and peace. On the 16th, Darrell Figgis was elected as an independent Member of Parliament for the Dublin County constituency. In his book, The Irish Constitution Explained, he had wrote, "The presence, therefore, in our Constitution of both the referendum and the initiative is therefore a sign that the people of Ireland are to be rulers in their own house, not merely as against foreign control, but as against the dominance of political parties. It means more. It means that the responsibility is now definitely reposed in them. There are provisions which, in the present draft of the Constitution, could with advantage be changed, for to require in Article 47 that a petition from the people of not less than 1/20 of the voters then on the register is necessary, and the alternative of a vote of 3/5 of the Senate before a measure can be put to the referendum is to impose an almost impractical and certainly an extremely difficult task. It reveals a fear of the exercise of the referendum that experience in other countries does not justify. With the wide franchise allowed in the Constitution, the tendency would be to play into the hands of political parties, and one of the purposes of the referendum is to destroy the power of political parties. Yet a slight change here may easily be made, and the essential fact is that the people of Ireland, having asserted the fact of their sovereignty and defined its qualities, proceed to exercise its functions by holding over the Oireachtas the two instruments of the referendum and the initiative. How will those functions be exercised? It is impossible to say, except that there is no education like the education of responsibility. With the referendum in their hands, especially with the initiative added to it, the will of the people is always present. The people can hasten legislation where it moves slowly. They can retard it where it presses too fast ahead. They themselves can make the pace. And the effect on themselves is that, with this added responsibility, they take a quick interest in their own concerns. In the first place, they break up the power of political organisations, and in the second place, they themselves become alert and educated citizens, responsible and intelligent guiders of their own destinies. On the 22nd of June, Henry Wilson was assassinated, and the Provisional Government General Ginger O'Connell was kidnapped 4 days later. As a direct result of the political assassination, Winston Churchill sent Michael Collins a letter stating, "The presence in Dublin of a band of men styling themselves the headquarters of the Republican Executive is a gross breach and defiance of the treaty. The time has come when it is not unfair, premature or impatient for us to make to the strengthened Irish government and the new Irish Parliament a request in express terms that this sort of thing must come to an end. If it does not come to an end, if through weakness, want of courage, or some other less creditable reason it is not brought to an end, and a speedy end, then it is my duty to say, on behalf of His Majesty's Government, that we shall regard the treaty as having been formally violated, and we shall take no steps to carry out or legalise its further stages, and that we shall resume full liberty of action in any direction that may seem proper, or to any extent that may be necessary to safeguard the interests and the rights that are entrusted to our care." Collins's response was corrosive, but he was only too well aware that the British attacking the Four Courts were growing by the hour, which could escalate to a point where the Provisional Government troops might end up fighting alongside the British. Despite his anger against Churchill, Collins acted against his old comrades, and on the 28th of June, civil war broke out across Ireland. After 2 days, Dublin's largest public records office, known to have kept priceless manuscripts dating back to the famine and the 12th century, situated within the Four Courts, had been destroyed. On the 12th of August, Arthur Griffith died. The cause of death was reported as being due to heart failure. He was buried in Glasnevin Cemetery in Dublin. 10 days later, on the 22nd of August, Michael Collins was assassinated on his journey to Cork City. He was buried in Glasnevin Cemetery. The Civil War was raging and a form of martial law prevailed. The reaction of the four courts to the habeas corpus applications brought during the Civil War demonstrated that the judges were either unwilling or unable to provide effective protection of the fundamental rights of the population. The opponents of the Anglo-Irish Treaty also opposed the new Shanadaran, and 37 of the senators' homes were burnt to the ground. Others were intimidated, kidnapped, or nearly assassinated. The Irish Free State, as contemplated by the treaty, came into existence when its constitution became law on the 6th of December. On the 24th of May 1923, Eamon de Valera issued a statement telling the Republican Army to stand down and that the time for fighting with guns was over and that the political process is the best route towards change. An estimation of 3,000 people had been killed and 12,000 were taken as prisoner during the Civil War in Ireland. On the 18th of November 1924, Viggis's wife Millie committed suicide using a Webley revolver previously given to her by Collins following the 1922 assault. A letter was found referring to her injuries and depression brought on as a result of the attack. Millie was buried at Mount Jerome Cemetery in Dublin. In 1925, Viggis himself had taken his own life, 1 week after the death of his new love, Rita North, before they could be married. Rita died following an abortion in London and was brought back to Ireland, where she was buried at Glasnevin Cemetery. A small group of mourners, comprising of close family and friends, attended his interment. No state funeral was given. The man who had done so much for the new state was then written out of its official history, and his exploits and the great events that shaped the nation had almost been entirely forgotten. For almost 80 years, the location of his grave was lost, but had been rediscovered in May of 2008 under several inches of soil at West Hampstead Cemetery in London. On the 3rd of May 1928, Eamon de Valera announced a petition and gathered over 96,000 signatures and presented it to the Dáil on the 16th of May, prepared in accordance with Article 48 of the Irish Free State Constitution. As the initiative technically required a referendum of its own to enforce its implementation, de Valera referred to it in his specific plan to initiate the removal of the oath. His plan immediately hit the rocks, since his arch-rival Prime Minister William T. Cosgrave, who succeeded Michael Collins as chairman of the provisional government after he was killed, had already indicated his intention to get rid of the referendum and initiative articles by ordinary legislation before they could be used. On the 12th of July, the government passed the Constitutional Amendment Bill No. 10, which was designed to abolish Articles 47 and 48, even by using the device in Article 47 itself, which allowed for the waiving of delaying tactics if an act was necessary for the preservation of public safety, despite the large national protests of citizens in favour of direct democracy. The Free State Senate was also abolished entirely in 1936 after it delayed certain government proposals for constitutional changes. It opposed its own abolition, but this decision was overridden by the Dáil. De Valera later created a new Senate in the new 1937 Constitution of Ireland. During the drafting of the second Constitution, Eamon de Valera's third son Brian was killed in a horse riding accident on February 9, 1936. On the 29th of December 1937, the second Constitution of the state came into force, replacing the 1922 Constitution that omitted direct democracy, which then established a system of representative democracy following a national plebiscite held on the 1st of July 1937. On the 21st of December 1948, the Oireachtas signed the Republic of Ireland Bill No. 22. By doing so, the Act abolished the last remaining functions of the King in relation to the Irish state and on Easter Monday, the 18th of April 1949, Ireland was officially declared as a republic. Eamon de Valera died on the 29th of August 1975. He was buried in Glasnevin Cemetery.
Nothing great comes easy. It always, whether it's a great meal, learning how to play the violin great, or anything you do that you're great at takes a lot of hard work. And it's going to take a lot of hard work to figure out how to break through the political system that exists now and put direct democracy into play.